Hello guys, welcome to my channel. I'm the Savvy Daughter and I have built a tiny house on wheels. Throughout this whole project I've been collecting all of my receipts and putting them in this folder. So now today I have calculated the total cost of my tiny house and I'm going to share it with y'all, and we're going to go through a cost breakdown so that y'all can see how much money I spent to build this tiny house on wheels. The total cost of my tiny house build was $2,690. Now there are a couple of things that this does not include. It does not include the cost of the trailer that I built this tiny house on top of, because I did not buy the trailer. One of the reasons that I was able to build this tiny house is because my grandfather gave me the trailer that this tiny house is built on. Another thing that this price does not include is anything on the inside, such as my mattress, my heater, my stove, curtains, any of that. None of that is included in this total build cost. I have broken down the total cost of my tiny house into 7 different categories. The first one being my foundation. How much money did it cost to get from the bare trailer to having a foundation? It costed $270. The main 2 expenses of my foundation were the subfloor, which I used heavy plywood for that, and 2 sheets of that heavy plywood costed $93, and all of the hardware that I had to use, which is bolts, washers, and nuts, costed a total of $92. So $270 got me from a bare trailer to a strong foundation. My second category was framing. I spent $427 to frame my tiny house. Some of my main expenses for framing included the studs, which were about $85, all 3 of my windows, which were about $240, and my door plus the hinges, doorknob, all the hardware that it took to put up the door, which was about $54. My goal while building this tiny house was not necessarily to do it the cheapest that I possibly could, and it definitely was not to do it the most expensive that I possibly could. So windows were a good example as to something that I could have spent more money on, or I could have spent less money on them. One of the things I discovered while buying windows is that it's really expensive to ship windows. I have a little tiny 1 foot by 1 foot window in the front of my tiny house that I ordered off of Amazon for about $20, but with shipping it ended up costing about $45, just because windows are really fragile, so they're difficult to ship, which I understand, but I decided to buy my other 2 locally so that I wouldn't have to pay for shipping. I also probably could have figured out how to buy windows used or something, and they would have been less expensive, but I wanted to make sure that the windows in my tiny house were strong because I hoped to be able to drive it down the road, and I did not want shattered windows with rumbling of the road, and I wanted to make sure that they had big screens on them so that in the summer when it's hot I could open the windows and have a good breeze going through my tiny house. My next category is the roof, and my roof costed a total of $138. The main expenses for my roof were the rafters, which were $32, the OSB decking, which was the first layer of my roof, and the OSB was about $35. The paper, which is like tar paper that waterproofs the roof, was $33, and the metal, the final layer that goes on the very top of my roof, was $24. This was a fairly inexpensive way to build my roof, and it's actually the most inexpensive category that I have. It didn't cost very much money to build the roof. It's a very simple, straightforward way to build a roof. It's just like a barn roof that slopes downward. It's just covered in metal, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't leak, and it's done everything I needed to. It was helpful that my dad knew of a metal shop locally that we were able to go buy the metal for my roof from, and that made it very cost effective and simple. The next thing I had to buy, and my 4th category, is my siding. And of course, the main expense in this category was my actual siding, which is T111. T111 is really stiff, it's thick, and it's strong, which I wanted because siding makes the whole tiny house strong, and the total cost for my T111 was $339, so that's almost the whole cost for siding. The rest of the money was spent buying little fill-in boards for the front and the back where I may have messed up my siding a little bit, and there you go. I have a very blue tiny house, so I figured that this 5th category should just be paint. I spent $277 on paint and paint supplies. The paint itself for this whole tiny house was a total of $198. And then I spent $80 on paint supplies. This includes rollers, the roller frames, the trays, the paint brushes, just anything I could need for painting. When I went to Home Depot to buy my paint, they had a few paint colors like white or barn red that were already mixed, they were ready to go, and they were less expensive than the blue paint that I bought, at least by a little bit. But I decided to go with this blue paint just because I love blue. It's just kind of a personal touch to my tiny house to have a blue tiny house. That's one of the things I wanted, so I spent a little bit of extra money to make this tiny house blue. When you're building something yourself, you can make it however you want. You can put all the little personal touches in it that you want as long as it fits into your budget. And so, my tiny house is Smurf blue. My sixth category is insulation, and insulation costed a total of $363. Now that may sound like a lot, but when I say insulation, I am counting trim, caulk, Great Stuff, and the actual insulation that I put inside the walls and in the ceiling and everything, like the foam insulation. I'm counting all of that into this category. The total cost of trim, at least on the outside of my tiny house, was about $58. Trim seals the whole thing up, it prevents leaks, so I figured it was worth putting in this category, and it makes it look good. So that was trim. Insulation, which is the actual foam that I put inside the walls and the ceiling, costed $60. And I used really thin insulation because the winters where I live are not very cold, so I did not need thick insulation, and this made it not cost as much. I spent $90 on caulk. To me, that sounds like a lot. I just bought tubes of caulk at Home Depot, and it was $90. Caulk, at least the kind that I used, was $3 a tube. So, I used a lot of tubes of caulk, and when I was adding that up, it was kind of crazy to me that, I spent almost $100 on caulk. I spent $50 on Great Stuff, which is just foam, basically, that comes out of a can, and then it expands, and it fills up any kinds of cracks, so that was part of insulation. And there are more random things that account for the rest of this cost. We're almost done. My last category was the inside of my tiny house. The main expenses for this were my ceiling, which are just 1x10 boards. It ended up looking really pretty in my opinion. And my ceiling costed $222. It was beautiful, but I thought that was quite a bit of money for the ceiling. My siding on the inside, not including shiplap on the back wall, was $141. The trim on the inside was about $23. My shiplap on the back wall, which is just my really pretty wall and the wall that I wanted to look really good, was $182. My floor was $91, but this includes the rug that I have on my floor because my flooring, for my flooring, I just used really thin 5mm plywood, and I put a rug down on top of the thin plywood to protect the rug and not get footprints everywhere, so my rug is just part of my flooring. I had a lot of leeway on the price for the inside because a lot of the stuff on the inside had to do with how it looked, not how strong the tiny house was, so I could choose to do things cheaper or more expensive, and I waited to design a lot of the inside until I got to the end so that I could figure out how much money I had left after I had done the rest of the project. Specifically, I chose to use basically its really thin T111 for 3 walls of the siding on the inside of my tiny house. Not necessarily because I think it's the most beautiful thing in the world, but because I do like the way it looks and it was very cost effective. My ceiling and my shiplap on the back wall are very beautiful, and they're probably my favorite parts to the inside of my tiny house, but they were expensive. So for me, I couldn't really afford putting shiplap on 3 of the walls or even all 4 of the walls as I might have liked to do if I had an infinite budget, but I certainly don't. So it's just one of those things where you have to be smart with your money and just think about making compromises where you can make something nice, but maybe not the absolute nicest it can be if you don't have the money to do so. My floor is the other thing that I went a little bit cost effective on. Instead of deciding to get a laminate floor or something that you have to install, I just decided to put plywood down and a rug on top of the plywood. Part of this has to do with the fact that it's very cost effective, and the other part of it has to do with I didn't really want to deal with installing flooring, which I've never done before, in a tiny space. I just didn't really want to deal with that, and I was at the very end of this project, so I didn't want to get stuck doing something that I didn't know how to do, and anyway, the floor turned out good. A couple of things I did during this build that saved myself money was that I used my dad's tools to build this whole thing basically, so I didn't have to buy a drill or a saw or anything like that. Now I will grant y'all that I'm 16 years old, so I still live with my parents, so this might have been easier for me to do than it is for y'all to do, but maybe y'all already have tools, or maybe you can borrow them from a friend or a parent or whoever. If you can borrow tools to use them, obviously that is very cost effective because you don't have to buy them yourself. And the other thing I did is that my family has a scrap wood pile that just basically sits in our yard from projects that we've done before, and I was able to take some boards and things from that wood pile to use in this tiny house, at least as much as I could. Obviously I still had to buy a lot of wood, but there were a few things here and there that I was able to use from our scrap wood pile instead of having to buy. A money-saving tip that I did was I bought my door used from a Habitat for Humanity store. So if you're able to buy maybe windows or a door or something like that used, it'll definitely help with your budget. And one more little money-saving tip is try to use wood from your mistakes. I messed up the siding for one of the sides of my tiny house on the outside. But what I did is I saved the messed up boards even though I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to use them or not. And I was actually able to use them later in the build to build a top for my bed. So that all just kind of goes back to the wood scrap thing. Like if you have extra wood, save it. You never know what you're going to need it for because wood is expensive, and if you have wood that you're able to use, it can really knock down the price. I spent $2,690 to build this tiny house. I used my own money, and I'm very proud of how it turned out and pleased with the result. I hope this encourages y'all to maybe build a tiny house of your own or something like this, because you can do it however you need to not break the bank. You can modify it and do whatever you need to get it done. I hope you guys enjoyed, or maybe you found it at least interesting, and I hope to see you on the next one.